Queen Camilla's summer holidays were brushed off as mere private retreats. She'd vanish quietly to the same countryside villa, never taking staff or family along, always keeping her location secret, and no one questioned it until King Charles decided to inspect the property himself. What he and Prince William found inside those walls would send shockwaves through the royal household and beyond. But what really went on inside that villa? And how did it push the monarchy to the edge of collapse? Join us as we expose the disturbing truth behind Queen Camilla's secret holidays. Queen Camilla's secret holidays. Every summer, right when the rest of the royal family travel across the world for their usual vacations, Camilla would quietly disappear to the same villa hidden somewhere in the English countryside. She never missed a year. The timing was always the same, the destination unchanged, and the secrecy surrounding it grew tighter with every passing season. No official announcement ever mentioned her travel plans, and the palace press office had learned long ago not to include her in the royal holiday schedules. It had become her private ritual, an escape that seemed harmless at first, but soon began to draw more attention than she could have imagined. The shocking secret behind Camilla's holiday routine will change everything you thought you knew about her. But before we reveal all of that, let's briefly discuss the villa. The villa itself sits behind tall hedges, surrounded by acres of manicured gardens and an old stone wall that kept the world at a distance. Locals called it the silent house because no sound ever came from it. Not music, not laughter, not even the hum of staff conversation. Even the birds seemed to avoid its grounds. The neighbors rarely saw her arrive or leave. A convoy of dark vehicles would slip in one morning and disappear 2 weeks later. Inside those 2 weeks, the villa went completely off the grid. Phones were locked away, deliveries were banned.
I mean, it was wonderful, the reception. You know, I couldn't believe how warm
and no one, not even Charles or William, could reach her directly. Initially, people thought it was just Camilla's way to rest. However, it began to feel more like a dark obsession over the years. According to palace sources, Charles had tried to join her once in the early years of their marriage. Surprisingly, she refused politely but firmly, saying she needed quiet to think. That reason became her shield every time the subject came up again. William never pressed the matter, though he found it strange that she would isolate herself so completely, especially when the family valued togetherness during holidays. Her refusal to allow anyone, no family, no friends, and no attendants to accompany her, had turned what should have been a simple retreat into one of the most rumored mysteries within royal circles. The palace staff understood the rule. Her holidays were never to be questioned. The orders came directly from the private secretary's office. The butlers, drivers, and housekeepers involved in the trip signed special non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing even the smallest detail. It was as though she vanished into another world, one that existed parallel to the royal family but entirely disconnected from it. The few who worked there during her stays described an atmosphere of quiet intensity. Every task was done precisely, every surface cleaned, and every curtain fell perfectly even. There was no room for imperfection, no space for conversation beyond the necessary. Stay tuned, because here's where things start to get really strange. Outside the palace, the media grew curious each year. Newspapers such as the Daily Mail and the Mirror ran stories about her absences. According to the reports, the Queen's holidays were mystery getaways. Some claimed she was meeting private consultants or spiritual healers. Others suggested she was working on secret memoirs or even managing her own network of influence separate from the crown. Photographers attempted to follow her convoys but always lost track before reaching the countryside. The few blurred photographs that surfaced showed nothing more than an estate gate and a shadow at a window. What made it worse was the total lack of leaks. In a world where royal secrets often found their way into tabloids within hours, Camilla's private world remained impenetrable. Her villa operated on paranoia. Staff were instructed to communicate only through handwritten notes slipped under doors. Meals were prepared according to exact instructions and left outside her suite without a word. There was no access to the main building without clearance from the head of her private security. Even letters from the palace were screened and delivered through an internal courier who never saw her face. The rules were so strict that when a young gardener once tried to take a phone picture of the grounds, he was dismissed the same evening and replaced by someone brought in from outside the region. No one ever questioned why. But there's something most people don't know about this. You see, the security around the villa was unusually advanced for a private residence. According to estimates by local contractors, the system cost more than £300,000 to install, complete with motion sensors, underground trip alarms, and high-definition cameras hidden in garden lamps. Guards rotated every 6 hours, maintaining constant surveillance even when the property appeared empty. There were checkpoints along the private driveway, and vehicles were searched before entry, even if they carried palace-approved staff.
I think they saw that. But I think, I have to admit, in the end, I ended up probably.
What surprised everyone most was that no one, not even senior palace officials, could request security footage without Camilla's written consent. It was her fortress, and she guarded it like one. Those who entered the villa during her stays described the atmosphere as both perfect and unnatural. Every room was symmetrical. The curtains were drawn halfway to allow filtered light, but not enough to see outside. Flowers were replaced daily, always white roses. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something sterile, like preserved air in a museum. The floors were polished to glass, and not a single book or photo frame appeared out of place. Visitors were left unsettled. The place was simply too clean, too quiet, and almost staged. Camilla's habits during these retreats also added to the strangeness. She would spend long hours reading in the garden, but never seemed to turn the pages often. Sometimes, she would take solitary walks around the property at dawn, whispering softly to herself. On other days, she stayed indoors for hours with curtains drawn, the only sound being faint footsteps moving from room to room. Staff sometimes heard low murmurs from behind closed doors.
No, it was just sort of being with police
But they never asked questions. Her meals were light and repetitive, mostly soups and tea, and she never requested entertainment. The villa became a world designed entirely for her silence. Over time, the estate itself became a kind of symbol within royal life. When her name came up in conversation, senior aides and family members alike would exchange quiet glances. The younger staff who joined the palace service were warned not to ask about the villa. Rumors traveled nonetheless, some harmless, others deeply unsettling. People whispered that the walls of that villa had seen more secrets than any other royal property. It became a metaphor among journalists and insiders alike. When someone said, "She's gone to the villa," it didn't just mean a holiday, it meant retreating into mystery. Within the royal family, curiosity slowly turned into unease. Charles respected her privacy but began to wonder what drew her back there. William found it odd that even her staff rotation changed yearly, as though she didn't want anyone returning twice.
And he definitely is the cheeky one. They look very alike, but it seems that they've got quite different personalities.
The Queen's former dresser once mentioned that the villa's furniture had been replaced 3 times in 10 years, yet no one could explain why. It was as if she wanted to erase any trace of her own presence after each stay. The years passed, and the pattern remained. Each summer, Camilla would vanish into that stone-walled estate, shielded from cameras and questions, coming back 2 weeks later looking refreshed but distant. Whatever she sought within those walls stayed there with her. Something about it no longer felt like a private retreat. It felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered. And soon, that secret would force its way out during a royal property inspection that would change everything the royal family thought they knew about her. Things are about to go wild. Keep watching. King Charles' shocking discovery. When King Charles decided to carry out a quiet inspection of all royal properties, it was supposed to be nothing more than routine. He had taken a personal interest in ensuring every estate was being well maintained and secure, especially as questions had been rising in Parliament about royal spending. There were dozens of properties scattered across the country, from Balmoral to Sandringham. But one in particular caught his attention, the secluded countryside villa. that Camilla disappeared too, every summer. It had been years since he had seen the place himself. Since she was away on her usual retreat abroad, he saw it as the perfect time to look things over. William agreed to join him, partly out of curiosity and partly because he had always found the mystery of that villa unsettling. Their journey was deliberately quiet. There were no press photographers, no staff cars following behind, and no official announcement of the visit. They traveled with only 2 trusted aides in a discreet black Range Rover, leaving Windsor early in the morning before the public noticed. The countryside roads were empty, lined with frost and mist. As they neared the estate, the air grew heavier, and even William felt a strange tension building. It was meant to be just another inspection, but something about this trip didn't feel ordinary. At first, it seemed normal, until it wasn't. When they reached the gates, the guards were visibly startled.
This slimmed-down monarchy is designed to represent modern...
The king rarely made unannounced appearances, especially at Camilla's private residence. Still, they quickly opened the heavy iron gates, and the convoy rolled into the long tree-lined driveway. The villa came into view slowly through the fog, tall, still, and too perfect. The gardens were flawlessly trimmed, the gravel freshly raked, and yet there was an eerie emptiness to it all. The air felt thick, as though sound itself had been swallowed. Charles noticed immediately that there were no birds on the property, not even a crow or sparrow. Even for winter, that was unusual. The butler, who had been stationed there since the last retreat, greeted them nervously. He explained that everything had been kept exactly as Camilla left it, per her standing orders. Charles walked through the entrance hall, his shoes scratching the marble floor, while William stayed behind, scanning the furniture and carefully arranged vases. The entire house looked as though it had been cleaned minutes ago. The carpets were new, the silverware shone without a single fingerprint, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and disinfectant. The windows were spotless, the drapes evenly pleated, and the fireplace looked unused. Here's where things start to get strange.
Welsh mounted pony, and I remember there was a very large horse show next door to us called Ditchling Horse Show.
Charles paused in the sitting room and noticed something odd. The grandfather clock by the wall had stopped at precisely midnight, even though its mechanism was new. The piano nearby had its cover on, yet the keys under had been polished recently, as if someone had touched them not long ago. In the corner stood a chair that faced the wall, slightly out of alignment with the rest of the furniture. The king felt a small chill. William, walking behind him, remarked quietly that it didn't feel like a house left empty. It felt like a place waiting for someone. As they moved deeper inside, the perfection of the villa became almost oppressive. Every object looked staged, as if part of a museum exhibit. In the dining room, 12 crystal glasses were arranged on the table, even though Camilla dined alone during her visits. In the study, piles of neatly stacked letters sat untouched beside a feather pen. A fresh bouquet of white roses stood in the same vase that had been reported to palace records 5 years earlier. It was as if time had stood still within those walls, every detail carefully preserved. But there's something most people don't know about this. Behind the scenes, Charles's security team had once raised quiet concerns about the villa's strange upkeep. According to palace sources, the utility records showed fluctuating energy consumption, even when it was supposed to be empty. And once, a maintenance contractor had reported hearing faint music playing inside during the off-season. These details were brushed aside as system errors or simple misunderstandings. But now, standing there, both Charles and William could sense something beneath the surface that didn't belong. They entered the library next, a long, narrow room lined with oak shelves and thick red drapes. It should have been a comforting space, but it wasn't. William noticed several books pulled slightly out of place, and a few papers scattered across the writing desk. Every one of them turned face down. The ink had faded on some pages, suggesting they'd been there for months. On one corner of the desk lay a stack of photographs turned upside down, their edges curled from age. Charles hesitated before touching them. Something about the room felt private, almost sacred, as though it held memories no one was meant to disturb. It didn't make sense until they looked closer. As they examined the shelves, William noticed faint markings on the wall behind one of the portraits. Small, almost invisible scratches forming what looked like letters or initials. He leaned closer and realized they spelled out something incomplete, as if someone had started writing and stopped midway. The air in the room grew colder. Charles turned one of the papers over and found what appeared to be a half-written note. The handwriting was Camilla's, unmistakable, but the words were cryptic and harsh. It mentioned something being kept hidden until the right time, followed by a name that had been scratched out so violently the paper tore. William set the photos upright and froze. They were all of Princess Diana, some from public appearances, others clearly private, perhaps taken by photographers who had never released them. Each had markings or notes written in the margins, circled faces, and highlighted details. It wasn't an ordinary collection. It looked like a study, maybe even surveillance. The realization shocked him. Charles said nothing, but the tension between father and son was unmistakable. The air felt too heavy to breathe. They left the library in silence and walked toward the master bedroom. The corridor leading there was lined with framed artwork and scented candles.
As Canada moves forward with nation-building projects.
Though none had been lit, their footsteps echoed softly, the only sound in the vast house. The further they went, the colder the air became, as though the walls themselves were warning them to stop. Charles hesitated at the bedroom door. The handle was shiny, and a faint smell of perfume came from it. He turned it slowly, his hand trembling slightly. What they discovered will leave you speechless. The room inside was perfect at first glance. Immaculate bedspread, sunlight filtering softly through white curtains, and a dressing table arranged with brushes, jewelry boxes, and perfume bottles. But beneath the surface, perfection lay something that unsettled them both. A drawer left slightly open revealed envelopes marked with dates that coincided with Diana's major public appearances years earlier. On the dresser was a small box filled with press clippings, all focused on the late princess. Some had headlines crossed out with ink, others had comments scribbled in margins. There was even a folded napkin from a charity event where Diana had once appeared, pressed flat like an artifact. Charles stepped back, visibly shaken. He had expected a simple inspection but found a shrine that felt both intimate and obsessive. William's eyes moved across the room, taking in every object, his silence saying more than words ever could. They both knew this was no ordinary retreat space. It was something else entirely. They stood there for a long time, neither moving nor speaking. The house that had always been described as her sanctuary now felt like a chamber of secrets, one that had been waiting for them to uncover it. And that's when everything changed. The rest of the inspection was brief. They left the bedroom quietly and made their way out, each lost in thought. The silence that followed them back down the hallway was heavier than when they arrived. Outside, the air seemed colder, sharper, as if the world itself had shifted. The villa no longer looked peaceful. It looked haunted by purpose. Neither of them mentioned what they had found, not yet, but deep down, they both understood that this discovery was only the beginning, and whatever truth waited ahead would shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. Queen Camilla's obsession. The master bedroom felt more suspicious than the rest of the villa. It wasn't the kind of feelings caused by the silence, but something colder, something that made both Charles and William stop at the door without saying a word.
The Earthshot Prize, the biggest, global environment prize in history.
As they stepped further in, William's eyes caught the first photograph on the far wall, and his breath froze. There was Princess Diana, smiling in one of her most iconic photos, but the image had been defaced. Thick red markings slashed across her eyes, and beneath it were words scrawled in Camilla's unmistakable handwriting. The wall wasn't adorned with family portraits or royal memories. It was covered, almost from floor to ceiling, with images of Diana, each one altered, crossed out, or written over with unsettling messages. What had once been a private retreat now felt like the inside of someone's disturbed mind. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. Every inch of the room told a story of bitterness that had clearly built up for years. Some photographs were torn into halves. Others had words like fraud or enemy scribbled across them. On the writing desk sat a small stack of newspaper clippings from the 90s. all about Diana's public appearances and her growing popularity. The margins were filled with notes, small, angry lines written in Camilla's neat but sharp handwriting. It wasn't the tone of rivalry anymore. It was obsession, the kind that consumes and distorts everything around it. Then came the moment that shattered them both. Under a framed photo of the Paris crash lay a piece of paper with the words, "Finally, she is out of the way." It was written in the same ink, the same hand, and it turned the room into something unbearable. William's knees went weak as he stared at it. For a few seconds, the silence became suffocating. His disbelief gave way to nausea, grief, and then a wave of anger that had no outlet. Charles stood frozen, his face pale, his fingers trembling as he reached for the nearest table to steady himself. But what happened next shocked everyone. Behind the wardrobe, half hidden by an ornate curtain, they found a map pinned to the wall. It was a detailed outline of Diana's past movements: London, Paris, New York, each location marked with notes and dates that matched events from decades earlier. It wasn't the sort of thing one stumbled upon by accident. It was deliberate, studied, and methodical. Tiny labels like charity dinner, hospital visit, and meeting with designer showed a level of tracking that was far too sophisticated to be a coincidence. It was as though someone had been following her life long after she was gone. Beside the map lay a small chest filled with letters, most of them unsigned, but clearly written by the same hand. They carried venom in every line, criticisms, jealousy, resentment, all circling back to the same woman. William hesitated before picking one up, but when he did, the sentences read like fragments of someone's unraveling thoughts. None of it felt rational. Every word was coded in hatred but structured with the discipline of someone who had been holding it in for far too long. As they moved closer to the bed, the atmosphere turned even colder. Photographs of Diana in her happiest moments, smiling with her sons, attending charity events, had been pinned on corkboards with scribbles layered over them, as if someone had rewritten history in their own mind.
That we are on the verge of a worldwide epidemic, and others who claim
The obsession wasn't a passing phase, it had roots, deep and tangled. It revealed a bitterness that had outlived its origin, something that had evolved into ritual. Charles realized then that this wasn't about jealousy anymore. It was about control, about erasing someone who refused to disappear, even in death. There was a drawer in the bedside table, locked but not fully closed. William forced it open, and inside were more photos, older ones, clearly reprinted. Now they understood why Camilla had always kept the villa off limits, why no staff ever stayed longer than a season, why her retreats always followed the same secret pattern. What had looked like solitude was, in truth, ritual, an annual return to a private world built entirely on resentment. They agreed without words that they had to return to the palace immediately. There were too many questions that demanded answers, too many years of silence that suddenly made sense. But as the car drove away from the villa, both men knew that whatever they had just uncovered was not the end. It was only the beginning of something darker waiting to unfold. The news of what Charles and William found inside the villa could not stay buried for long. Within hours of returning to the palace, Charles summoned an emergency meeting behind closed doors. Only his most trusted advisors were allowed in, but even they could see the shock written across his face. The discovery wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a threat to the very image of the monarchy itself. Every word spoken in that room carried the weight of centuries of royal reputation. What began as a private discussion quickly turned into chaos. Advisors argued over damage control, while palace staff whispered in corridors. Some insisted the truth should never reach the public, warning that the monarchy could not survive another scandal of this scale. Others urged honesty, claiming that secrecy would only make things worse once the media uncovered it. Charles listened quietly, but deep down, he had already made up his mind. He could not pretend that what he saw in that villa didn't exist. As the palace tried to manage the situation, Camilla was already on her way back from her retreat, unaware that her hidden world had been exposed. She expected the usual silence to greet her return. Instead, she walked into a storm. Charles and William were waiting, the evidence laid out in front of them. Photographs, letters, maps, everything they had found. The confrontation began in heavy silence, and when Charles finally spoke, the tremor in his voice carried more disappointment than anger. Camilla tried to dismiss it at first, insisting it was all misunderstood. She described it as research, claiming she had been studying the public obsession with Diana for historical reasons. But when William demanded answers about the hateful messages and the obsessive notes, her composure cracked. Her tone turned defensive, almost cold, as if the shrine had been nothing more than a private coping mechanism. Her explanation didn't convince either of them. What hurt Charles most wasn't the existence of the shrine, but her lack of remorse. He saw no guilt in her eyes, only irritation that her secret had been found. William's fury filled the room. The image of his mother's defaced photos would not leave his mind. The confrontation ended with a silence so heavy it felt final. Within days, a leak reached the press. No one knew from where, but once it surfaced, it spread globally. Major tabloids from London to New York ran headlines that shook the royal household. Images of Diana's defaced portraits and the map of her movements began circulating online. The palace immediately denied the reports, calling them distorted fabrications. But public trust was already slipping. Social media exploded with outrage, and old wounds reopened across the world. Thank you for staying with us. What do you think about Camilla's actions? Share your opinions with us in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Also, click the following video on your screen and you will enjoy it.